Today, we're asking, how do government systems shape population behavior and social norms? We will compare some of the major ones like dictatorships, authoritarian systems, monarchies, and republics. And we will separately address economic systems, often mistaken for government types, such as capitalism, socialism, and communism.
Our organizing framework is four levels that shape everyday behavior. First, accountability, how leaders can be replaced or constrained. Second, information, how speech, media, and knowledge are governed. Third, resources, how livelihoods, healthcare, housing, and opportunity are distributed. Fourth, state coercion, how force, surveillance, propaganda, and punishment are used and bounded.
So, to make this concrete, people don't wake up and think, oh, I'm living in a monarchy, so I'll behave like X. They actually learn through consequences what is rewarded and what is punished. And then that becomes the norm.
Exactly. Norms are in part a population level memory system. Repeated reinforcement teaches individuals what is safe, what is possible, and what is futile. Because I'm a neuropsychologist, we should add a clinical note very early on. Listeners sometimes ask whether certain political systems cause DSM-5 diagnoses, DSM being the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's a classification manual used by clinicians to describe recognized mental disorders and the criteria used in evaluation.
A government system does not assign a diagnosis to an individual, but political and economic environments can alter exposure to risk factors, chronic fear, instability, violence, displacement, social fragmentation, and poverty, which can increase population level vulnerability to conditions such as depression, anxiety disorders, and post traumatic stress symptoms.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. And there's an important measurement problem here, as a matter of fact. In repressive environments, suffering can rise while diagnosis rates fall because care is scarce, stigma is high, or it's just unsafe to admit the stress. It's almost like you're walking on eggshells.
Well, yeah, that's a good colloquialism there. It really is a problem that I'm sort of seeing happening around me right now, with people really getting disturbed, distressed, and depressed because they feel helpless to change what they see as being not good. So, public health often uses the concept of social determinants of health, like the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, and the distribution of power and resources shaping those conditions.
In conflict affected settings, the burden of mental disorders can be markedly elevated. A widely cited World Health Organization associated meta analysis estimated prevalence around 1 in 5 in post conflict settings for selected disorders.
So we will speak carefully. Systems shape stressors and protective factors. They do not mechanically produce a diagnosis, but they can create conditions that make those diagnoses more likely.
A dictatorship concentrates power in one person or in a narrow clique. Removal is typically non electoral through a coup or an assassination, non transparent, or practically impossible. Historically, we might think of personalist dictatorships like North Korea or Argentina under the Perones, or military juntas. Cases vary, procedures vary, but the shared feature is an extremely narrow accountability channel.
And what does that do to normal behavior? Three common adaptations show up across many cases. Self censorship becomes automatic, not only about politics, but about being misinterpreted. Public conformity plus private divergence, a split between performance and belief.
So, what you're saying there is that people behave one way in public, and then in their private lives, they behave or say differently. Is that what we're
Behave,
saying?
say, or even believe differently. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Trust collapses inward. People rely on kin, close friends, and informal networks rather than institutions.
Historically, dictatorial systems of all kinds have often built parallel structures: loyal security services to bypass the military, patronage networks, and propaganda systems to stabilize rule.
So, everyday life becomes less about what is right and more about what is safe.
Yes. And clinically, that shift can matter. When environments are unpredictable and punitive, the brain's threat detection circuitry can become chronically engaged, leading to hypervigilance, sleep disruption, irritability, and concentration problems. Those are not diagnoses by themselves, but they are the psychological cost of living under sustained uncertainty.
Examples of these type of dictatorships here can include North Korea under the personalist dictatorship of the Kim family. See our Kim podcast to learn about that. Historical cases: Haiti under the Duvaliers, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Chile under General Pinochet, each with distinct institutions, ideologies, and purposes, but a similar concentration of power enforced by violence.
So that Duvalier, you're talking about Papa Doc?
And his son.
Yes. Okay. I just thought some people might know that name better than the Duvaliers.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that, Dr. Weaver. And the social norm that follows is often cautiousness. People become careful about what they say, who they associate with, and even how visible they are.
Authoritarianism is broader than straight dictatorship. Authoritarian systems may have legislatures, courts, elections, a semi free press, but accountability is constrained. Opposition is limited, media freedom narrow, and coercion and bribery can be used selectively against political threats. The best example of that is South Africa under apartheid. It was a democracy for whites and an authoritarian system for most other people, or Egypt under Nasser. A severe subtype is totalitarianism: Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, and the Soviet Union, where the state seeks to control not just politics, but culture, education, and all types of private life.
From a behavioral standpoint, authoritarian environments produce distinctive learning in which signals comply in public, interpret ambiguity as danger, and trust institutions as instruments rather than neutral arbiters.
And for younger adults, that becomes a future problem. If you cannot protest their procedures, then you invest in connections in camouflage. You optimize for survival rather than contribution.
A historically stark example is Nazi Germany, where policing and surveillance became instruments of terror. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum describes how the leadership of the SS and the military helped forge the Gestapo, a secret state police using ruthless methods and torture to identify and arrest political opponents and others targeted by regime policy.
However, the SS did not wear masks. Hello, ICE. The information lever is crucial here. The regime invested heavily in propaganda. Gee, that sounds real familiar. Joseph Goebbels served as Minister of Propaganda and was central in presenting a favorable image of the Nazi regime to the German public.
So the point here isn't history trivia. Mechanism information control plus coercion introduces a population that learns the cost of dissent.
Now, it's a careful comparative note to introduce here. Even constitutional democracies can deploy coercive tools, and those episodes matter for norms, trust, and civic fear. The two classic examples are Kent State in the United States, May 4th, 1970, when the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of demonstrators, killing 4 students and wounding 9, and the suspension of habeas corpus in Canada that same year by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and his struggle against the FLQ terrorism. See our Deals with the Devil podcast to learn more about that.
Events like this can have lasting psychological effects on a society's sense of safety around one's participation, particularly in any kind of participation that indicates a difference with the prevailing government policies. When protest is perceived as potentially met with state violence, which I think we're seeing a lot, people learn avoidance, not just politically, but socially.
That's right, Dr. Weaver. And it changes the whole norm. We stop seeing protests as citizens speaking, and we start seeing it as risk exposure.
Boy, you're right about that, Chandler. Very right.
Historically, U.S. presidents have also deployed troops domestically under specific legal authorities, including the Insurrection Act, which permits domestic deployment under certain conditions. There are multiple historic episodes, sometimes framed as efforts to restore order, sometimes criticized as acts of suppression, such as the Bonus Army in 1932, the Detroit riots in 1968, and the Los Angeles riots in 1992.
The scholarly takeaway is not one event defines a regime, but rather when coercion becomes normal or unaccountable, it reshapes norms. Participation declines, fear rises, and trust erodes.
Well, Dr. Weaver, if I may, I would like to talk about some of these ICE related killings and the effects that it have on norms. And we need to be really, really precise here. There have been recent high profile fatal shootings involving federal immigration officers in Minneapolis, and the facts are contested and currently under investigation. Can we
So,
talk
what do
about that,
you?
Dr. Weaver?
Yes, can.
All right.
So, it is very important to recognize what is happening here. When you say ICE related killings, when people are put down on the ground, their weapons taken from them, which they were carrying, they had, permission to do so. They're put on face down and shot 10 times in the back. That's a little, brutal and vicious.
Yeah, I think that's going just a little bit too far, wouldn't you say? Just a little bit, just a teeny tiny little bit.
Yeah, and it's not just that incident either. There are many others. And and it is really quite disturbing. Go ahead, Dr.
In,
Deneen.
in January of this year, Alex Pretty was fatally shot by federal agents in Minneapolis. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, and there are ongoing investigations and disputed accounts about what occurred. There was also a fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis, amid broader controversy surrounding immigration enforcement operations.
Yes. I there's so much that could be said about that, but I don't want to get too far astray here. From a behavioral and mental health standpoint, community exposure to raids, detentions, and at the very minimum, controversial uses of force can elevate anxiety, fear conditioning, and avoidance, especially when residents perceive that rules are unclear or enforcement is erratic and unpredictable and aimed at people who have the least chance of defending themselves against masked, unidentified people.
You mean against cowards?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So, and what people don't seem to understand, Dr. Weaver, that it's not just contained to politics. It goes way deeper than that. It changes whether people go to work, whether people go to school, hospitals, and just whether or not they trust authorities at all.
There are also concerns about the outcomes of detention. A 2025 tally reported 32 deaths in ICE custody, with a debate over causes and accountability. ICE itself maintains detainee death reporting and emphasizes medical care, while critics dispute adequacy.
Yeah. You went over that real quick, Dr. Deneen, and I know that you have we differ on some of our perspective on this, but I'm going to just go back and review that. You said the tally reports 32 deaths in ICE custody. In other words, 32 people that were detained without legal process were in ICE custody, and they debate about causes and accountability. Well, let me just ask you this. If you have a person in your custody, Dr. Deneen, and that person dies, who's responsible for that?
I am obviously because I took this person under my control.
Yeah. So the debate over causes and accountability, no, I disagree with that. It really isn't accountability. There's no question there.
Well, because we know if these 32 people that have been held, we know who's accountable for them being held. We know who's responsible for their troubles. ICE. We know they are accountable. And may I add, Dr. Weaver, it's high time that these people start being held accountable.
Yes, yes. And to feel the full reciprocity of the law.
And may
Absolutely.
may I also say that one death, let alone 32, is too many.
Yes, sir. You know, this is exactly where the four levers intersect. Coercion practices affect trust. Information conflicts affect shared reality. And reduced trust can drive psychological stress, especially in vulnerable communities.
I couldn't agree more.
Let's change and look at monarchies. How about that, Dr. Deneen? Can you help us out?
A monarchy is defined by the hereditary leadership of a anointed ruler, a king, a sultan,
Mm-hmm.
uh, someone who's not elected, and there usually is a hereditary element. There are three main kinds. An absolute monarchy, the best example of that is Saudi Arabia, where the king and the crown prince have total control. Constitutional monarchies, Sweden, Japan, the United Kingdom, retain the monarch as a symbolic figurehead of state, while governance is conducted through a prime minister, a parliament, or legislature of some kind. There's a third type. Um, some of the other countries in the Middle East, Kuwait, Oman, the United Emirates, the monarch is not a figurehead, but they're not absolute either. They have similar power to a president in the sense they have a veto over legislation, which can be overridden by the democratic institutions. I,
Mm.
I, I just wanted to make that clear because everyone knows about constitutional monarchies and absolutes, and there is a third one, particularly in the last 20 years. The old imperial system in Germany prior to World War One was like that also. The Kaiser had substantial but not absolute power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very good summary. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Deneen. So the crown itself doesn't tell you whether people feel free. It's whether institutions constrain power and protect rights.
Yeah, behaviorally, monarchies often generate stronger norms of hierarchy and deference, sometimes culturally valued, sometimes politically enforced. In constitutional monarchies, those norms can coexist with pretty robust civil liberties, producing high stability without pervasive fear.
In absolute monarchies, the accountability lever is narrow. Dissent can be culturally taboo, sometimes legally risky. Social norms tend to reward loyalty, discretion, and respect for the status order. Societies like that are influenced informally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, right.
And from the young adult angle, stability can be attractive, but if advancement depends on proximity to power rather than open competition, it shapes ambition, who you become to succeed. And I think that sometimes that can become a slippery slope as well. You don't want to sell your soul to succeed, so be careful.
Yes, mental health pathways here depend less on monarchy and more on predictability, legal protections, coercion limits, and resource security.
Now, a republic is technically any system that's not a monarchy, but in this form, it's where political authority is derived from the public through representation, through voting, and so on. Leaders are not hereditary rulers. Republics range from the most robust liberal democracies to weaker systems where institutions exist but often function unevenly. The best examples of the traditional republic is France, India, our own United States, each with different histories, different institutional and political designs.
Yeah, in well functioning republics, accountability is routinized. Elections, independent courts, checks and balances are some of those routines, and civil liberties protections. These features they shape some pretty important norms, such as it's okay to dissent. The other thing is that you can have an expectation of due process. You can have civil participation, like marching in a protest march or whatever, voicing your opinion, and it's considered ordinary behavior, not treason.
But when institutions degrade, corruption appears unpunished. or procedures feel performative, the norm shifts to cynicism. People stop thinking that the system is ours and that it belongs to someone else, which I have to say, that's really scary because that's almost what's going on today, isn't it?
The republic's strength is not in the word republic, but in the credibility of its institutions. You're quite correct, both of you, that those institutions have to be reinforced, and there needs to be a continual awareness of people's rights.
Clinically, perceived agency matters. When people believe there are real channels for redress, it can kind of provide a buffer to stress. When agency collapses, the psychological profile shifts towards helplessness, anger, withdrawal. Again, not a diagnosis, but a risk environment. Okay, let's shift to some economic systems that are kind of often confused with government types. Now, we separate the government from the economic organization. You can have capitalism under a republic, a monarchy, or authoritarian rule. The same for socialism.
Capitalism emphasizes private ownership, exchange through markets, and a profit-based incentives for economic and personal development. It often produces norms of initiative, competition, innovation, and consumer identity.
But it also produces chronic status comparison. If worth becomes productivity, then burnout can become normalized, and then insecurity becomes a shared background noise, especially if healthcare, housing, and education are unstable.
Yes, you got that one right. Uh, from a mental health standpoint, insecurity and inequality can be very stress amplifying conditions. Social determinants, housing, income stability, and education access, well, those things shape population wellness.
Socialism can refer to a wide spectrum, from mixed economies with strong social safety nets, what's sometimes called social democracy, that happens in most Western European countries other than the United Kingdom, to more state-led control of key sectors. Common norms in such strong welfare states include higher expectations of collective provision, a large welfare state, and reduced catastrophic risk from illness or unemployment.
From my generation's perspective, that resource stability right there can lower baseline anxiety if it's well run. But people also worry about bureaucracy, sluggish responsiveness, and permission structures just for basic needs.
Yeah, clinically, predictability and access can be protective, again, mediated by trust in institutions and social cohesion.
Now, the most extreme form of economics is communism. That's an ideology that aims at collective ownership and ultimately a classless society where the state withers away and people live in human brotherhood. Historically, many communist states have become one party systems with significant state control over information and resources. In practice, norms often included strong conformity expectations, a new elite class of party bureaucrats with most of the power and money, and official language rituals, especially when dissent carried risk of imprisonment in gulags, psychological torture, or even execution.
Which means even if equality is the stated ideal, people learn that safety depends on compliance, and informal networks emerge to meet needs that the official system is unable to.
You know, Communism is one of those really strange systems because the underlying principle is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Well, there's a problem with that because guess who decides what their abilities are and what their needs are? It's not the people. Because as you pointed out, Dr. Deneen, that one party system with significant state control over information and resources acts, right?
Yes, and the problem becomes that the elite structures society for their own benefit while talking about the benefits to the masses.
Indeed. And, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, communism just won't work. The ideas may be okay in some ways, but it has always led to disastrous results.
Well, the basic idea I think is okay, but you're right. It does lead to a lot of disastrous results.
Indeed. Where coercion and surveillance are high, psychological stressors rise. They fly right through the roof, man. That risk pathway is consistent with evidence from conflict and repression context showing elevated mental health burdens across the population.
Let's synthesize what these systems tend to teach through the four levers. Speech norms, you were going to speak on that, Dr. Weaver.
Yeah, when speech is protected and punishment is kind of bounded, people practice disagreement. It's messy, but it's so productive. When speech is risky or ambiguous, people practice silence, coded language, and self surveillance.
And once a population learns self-censorship, it can persist even after rules loosen because fear is a memory system.
Let's look at trust norms, information, and accountability. If institutions are reliable, trust can expand beyond the family and one's immediate circle. If institutions are arbitrary, trust collapses into small circles.
Social trust functions as a cognitive shortcut, reducing mental load. When trust collapses, daily life becomes more exhausting. Constant vigilance, constant verification.
Now, this is a huge one for young adults in my generation. If rules shift unpredictably, then you stop planning long term. You become present focused, sometimes entrepreneurial, sometimes impulsive, and sometimes you just go simply numb.
Historically, unstable institutions reduce investment, economic and civic, because returns, financial, personal, become so chaotic and uncertain.
Yeah, healthy innovation. What does it require? Well, it requires bounded risk, the freedom to fail without catastrophic punishment. And when punishment is political or arbitrary, creativity narrows. There's an important question that's hanging around here in the air. And, before I get to that, I see this happening like, the pressure to get commentators, have them lose their jobs, like Jimmy Kimmel or, any of the other ones that make social comments that were not approved by the government here. And I think that's a problem. But anyhow, going back to the innovation and creativity issue here, first, a useful caution here. Governments often label themselves in ways that do not match how power operates in practice. Republic, democracy, people's, socialist, constitutional. These terms can describe ideals, branding, or legal forms, but the everyday reality is best measured by behavior, like how decisions are made, how errors are corrected, and how dissent is treated.
Historians and political scientists often distinguish formal institutions from effective institutions. A constitution can guarantee rights on paper, while enforcement is very inconsistent. Elections can exist while competition is constrained. Courts can exist while their independence is limited.
So the question then becomes, what system are people actually living under? Not what it promises, not what it's called.
Here's 5 empirical tests. Think of them as diagnostic questions for political systems. First is a transfer of power test. Can leaders be removed peacefully through regular procedures? And do they actually leave? If replacement is rare, dangerous, or symbolic, accountability is pretty weak. Second is a rule of law test. Do laws apply to powerful actors in practice? Can you say Epstein files? Watch whether corruption cases, police abuse, or official misconduct are investigated credibly, like maybe letting the state system in place in Minnesota do the investigation rather than being investigated by ICE, who is part of the problem there.
Well, yeah, you know what that's going to lead to. Of course, they're going to swing it in their favor.
Yep. Information test is another one. Can journalists, researchers, and citizens publish inconvenient facts without intimidation or punishment? I already talked about that. And we see that happening. Immense pressure. When the president of the United States says to a highly credible reporter that she's an embarrassment because she never smiles. A woman who never smiles is not a good person, I guess. Okay. And pay attention to whether criticism is answered with evidence or with threats, job loss, surveillance, detention, or vague accusations like extremism or national security. The fourth test could be opposition and association. Can people form political parties, unions, advocacy groups, and protest movements without being criminalized? A system can claim pluralism while making independent organization practically impossible. The last of these little empirical tests is to ask, is force bounded by transparent rules and oversight, or is it political and discretionary? When enforcement is unpredictable, populations learn self-censorship and avoidance.
A quick rule of thumb: ignore the name and follow the incentives. If careers, safety, and social standing depend on public loyalty rituals, the system is functionally more authoritarian, even if it holds elections. If the press is free, courts are independent, and leaders can lose power without military violence or a crisis, the system is functionally more accountable, even if the politics are messy.
And from a citizen standpoint, there's a simple live test. Do ordinary people feel safe telling the truth about the powerful? If the answer to that question is only in private, then you've learned something very important about what system you're actually living in.
Exactly. Names are rhetoric, systems are incentives, and incentives shape behavior, norms, and ultimately mental health. What can we say about governments, systems, and mental health? Kind of to summarize the mental health dimension with clinical caution here, the DSM provides a diagnostic criteria. It is not a political scorecard. Government systems shape exposure to stressors and protective factors, the social determinants of health. In settings of conflict, repression, or mass displacement, population level risk for disorders increases significantly, with substantial prevalence estimates in the literature. We can see it.
And importantly, high coercion environments can hide distress. Apparent order can coexist with high private suffering.
Absolutely, Dr. Deneen. So the practical question isn't which label fits. It's does the system create safety, agency, predictability, and dignity? Those are psychological nutrients.
Let's make a summary here of the different types of groups. A dictatorship has concentrated power, narrow accountability, strong incentives for public conformity and private caution. Authoritarianism, constrained accountability with selective coercion, norms of strategic silence and institutional pessimism. Totalitarian variants attempt a deeper social control. A monarchy, outcomes vary widely. Constitutional monarchies compare symbolism with democratic governance. Absolute monarchies narrow accountability. In a republic, legitimacy depends on institutional credibility. When it's strong, it supports dissent and civic agency. When weak, it drifts towards cynicism and polarization. Economic systems, capitalism, socialism, and communism shape resource security and different types of incentives, but the political structure determines how coercion, information, and accountability operate.
The core claim here is modest but powerful. Populations adapt rationally to the incentives they face, and those adaptations become norms, sometimes healthy, sometimes corrosive.
Absolutely, Dr. Weaver. And if listeners want one takeaway, then watch the four levers. When accountability shrinks, when information narrows, when resources become contingent, and when coercion expands, people change. Not because they became worse, but because they learned what survival requires.
Yeah, we could go on and on with this, but got to stop sometime. And I
Yeah.
guess this is the right time. Hope you'll come back and join us again. If you have comments, please leave them. Be glad to see them.
Take care, folks.
Bye for now, folks. Come back soon.